Good afternoon. My name is Lee Cobb. I'm a trustee with the Kiawah Conservancy, and today I'm delighted that we're able to present Dr. Eric McElroy, who will describe his research on Kiawah. Dr. McElroy received his Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Ohio Northern University in 2003 and his PhD from Ohio University in 2008. Dr. McElroy has been a member of the biology department at the College of Charleston since 2003, where he is currently an associate professor and an assistant chair. His current research focuses on ecology and evolution of function, morphology, and performance in animals, especially lizards and fish, as well as ecological studies of barrier islands near Charleston, South Carolina. We're delighted that he's agreed to present to us today. Before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about why you decided to do dune research on Kiawah?
So my interest in the dunes actually goes back to work that I have been doing on an introduced lizard that's found on Sullivan's Island, Isle of Palms, and Edisto. And that work started probably around 2013 or 2014. And so we had been out there for a few years studying this lizard, studying where it lived and what it ate, and decided to start studying the actual invertebrate communities on Sullivan's Island to determine if the lizard had an impact. And so that naturally led us to, so we got some data from Sullivan's that naturally led us to be interested in, well, what's going on other islands? And so Kiawah Island came to mind as an island where the lizard is not found. And since I've done some previous work there with reptiles and amphibians, I knew that the dunes were in really good shape and would maybe make a nice comparison to some of these islands where the lizard was present. And so that's really what was my initial interest in Kiawah was to come out and see, are the bugs living on the dunes different? And then we also became interested in the plants and sort of more generally the dune community over the course of the project.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, let's go ahead and listen to your presentation.
Hi, my name is Eric McElroy. Today I'll be talking to you about a survey on terrestrial invertebrates and plants that I did on the dune systems on Kiawah Island. And so why study plants in the context of the sand dunes? Well, plants are important for providing stability for the dune systems, and in doing so, they provide protection for the structures that sit just behind the dunes. So, for example, in this picture below us, we can see that there are houses here just behind the dune systems, here, and then down here. And of course, this big patch of dune in front with all of the plants covering it will provide protection for those houses, and the plants and their root systems help to stabilize the loose sands of those dunes. The other reason that plants within dunes are important is that they are a unique source of biodiversity. So there are several species that we see in the dunes that we do not see in other locations anywhere. And then, of course, why invertebrates? Well, invertebrates provide many different important ecosystem functions. So, for example, invertebrates are important in things like pollination, which you can see here with this ant that is drinking nectar from this flower and at the same time pollinating adjacent flowers. They're important for seed dispersal. So there are ant species living on the dunes that eat seeds, and in eating those seeds, they move them around, they occasionally drop them, and that helps new plants to grow in new locations. They're important for decomposition. So many invertebrate species will help to break down dead animals and plants into raw nutrients that can then move back into the ecosystem to support new plants and new animals. And then finally, they play a key role in the food web. So invertebrates are often a key link between the plants and larger animals. Additionally, many invertebrates can be thought of as ecosystem engineers. And so the picture on the right-hand side of this slide is a cast made of a harvester ant mound. And you can see that the sheer size of this mound is quite amazing. And you can actually find these in the dune systems in the Southeast US. And so one of the reasons we think this is important is that these chambers in this mound are going to contain larvae and food sources, and of course those occasionally decompose, and they provide nutrients into the soil, which can help support plant growth. The other thing about ants, especially as part of the dune system and in being ecosystem engineers, is that they, when they build their mounds, they of course have trash piles around the edge. So this, for example, you can see this ring around the edge of this ant mound. This is a trash pile full of seeds. And this is, again, important for moving nutrients around. It could also be a source of dispersal for the seeds. So helping to create a situation where the seed finds new soil and then can sprout and grow. Okay. And so given the importance of plants and invertebrates, I want to take you through the 4 main goals of this project. The first is that I'll take you through a survey that we completed of the terrestrial invertebrates and plants on some of the sand dunes of Kiawah Island. Next, I'll show you about spatial patterns in the plant, ant, and invertebrate communities on the sand dunes of Kiawah. Next, third, we'll look at the relationships between plants and invertebrates. So we want to know if plant species diversity is able to predict the diversity of ants and or invertebrates. And then finally, we'll look at the relationship between the biological components of the dune system, that is the plants, ants, and invertebrates, and some of the physical characteristics of the dune system, like how firm the soil is, or the amount of shade, or loose versus debris covered soil. Okay, and so for this survey, we originally set out to sample approximately 12 locations at Kiawah. We were able to obtain permission from the relevant authorities to sample 5 of those 12 locations. And so 2 of those locations are in West Beach, just behind the condos and the golf courses down here in West Beach, kind of near the community association. And then the other 3 sampling sites are in Surf Song. One of them is down near the beach club and fire station. And then the other 2 are a bit further up, right along Surf Song Drive. And if we zoom in a little bit more, you can get a better sense of exactly what these sampling locations look like. So over here on the left, we have West Beach. You can see shaded in this reddish color is a wider swath of dune sitting between this set of condos here, and then this new set of condos being built sort of between our sampling area and the county park. And then the other sampling area is more narrow and essentially sits from the community center and in front of the condos up to where they are doing some work on the golf course. At Surf Song, our locations, I have them here in orange, green, and this pinkish color. And these were essentially all in front of residences in the Surf Song neighborhood. If we zoom a little bit further in, you can get a sense of what our sampling scheme looked like to sample the plants, the ants, and the habitat characteristics. So we would define transects on the dunes, and then at the corner of a 20 by 20 meter grid defined by these transects, we would create a sampling point. So each of the little yellow pins represents a sampling point, and you can see that these are on a 20 by 20 meter grid. You'll notice it's an imperfect grid because at times the sampling is offset depending on things like boardwalks or heavy vegetation. There are places where you can't get a perfect 20 by 20 meter grid. But we approximated a 20 by 20 meter grid, giving us many samples for each site. And then what we did at each of those pinpoints, at each one of those sampling stations, is we carried around a circular quadrat. It was just a hula hoop. And we would set this hula hoop on the ground and quantify what was inside of it. Okay, so you can see in the middle of this hula hoop is a little pink flag. The hula hoop would sit around that pink flag, and then we would count and identify all of the plant species within that hula hoop, and we would make some measurements of the environmental characteristics. So for example, the amount of debris, the amount of open sand, the firmness of the ground. So we would actually measure the penetrance of the soil, defining it as sort of very loose versus very hard and firm. And so when we did that and we started to look at the data, I just want to very quickly give you a sense of some of the plant species that we encountered. And so there's actually quite a few different interesting plants on Kiawah. And so these are some of the more common species that we saw in the foredunes. So there's Russian thistle, which is this thorny thing that will dry out and form like a big sagebrush ball in the fall. And then beech tea, again, which is all over the place. There are several really beautiful flowering species. And so beech evening primrose here in the middle and beech morning glory are two of the more common species that you would be most likely to see when walking on the boardwalks, especially near the foredune. Back in the woods, you might find St. Andrew's cross, butterfly pea, or trailing fuzzy bean. And again, when these flower, they really, they're quite beautiful and can cover large portions of the dune. The main type of plant you see out on the dune is or are grasses, and there are many different species, and here I'm showing you just a couple. And so the one on the left here is called finger grass. You can see it gets its name from the seed head, which I'm holding in my hand, that kind of looks like some fingers sticking up. And on the right, we can see sweetgrass with its characteristic pinkish toned flower heads. Both are fairly abundant out on the dunes. One of the most common or most abundant species of grass on the dunes is blue stem, or another name for this is broom sedge. There are a couple different species. One is by far the most common, but there are places on the dunes where this is dominant. And so you can see that there are, I don't know, 20 or 30 different broom sedge plants that are flowering. The name comes from the fact that the spike, the flowering spike, looks like a broom and was actually used like a broom by early people in the United States. And then there are several sort of more ferocious plants. And so if you've ever walked on the dune itself, you'll know that you need to wear closed-toed shoes because of things like dune sandbur, which will readily break off of its stem and embed in your foot. And then at least 2 or 3 species of prickly pear, which can go from relatively benign, which is the eastern prickly pear. These are kind of big and easy to avoid, to very dangerous devil joint, which is in places very dense. And if you step on it, it will become embedded in your foot and is very hard to remove, very painful. And then finally, we see some or many situations where charismatic animal species, such as the Gulf fritillary butterfly, depend on some dune species for parts of its life cycle. And so while we were out there, we were able to find, this is not a common flower in the dunes, but there is maypop around the dunes. And maypop is a host for an important food source for the caterpillar of the Gulf fritillary. And so these, of course, are important aspects of plant diversity in terms of supporting animal diversity. Okay, and so coming back to our sampling stations, again, we had these circular quadrats that we would use. In the middle of each circular quadrat, we would deploy these test tubes that had a bit of diluted antifreeze, RV antifreeze in the bottom. And the purpose of these was to act as a pitfall trap for invertebrates. So invertebrates would walk along the surface and fall into the tube. And when they hit that antifreeze, they die. And that's how we then go back and collect the tube, and that's how we sample the invertebrates. It's important to note here that this kills a very small proportion of the animals, the invertebrates that you would find on the dune. And so it doesn't really have a major ecological effect on what's going on, but it is a great way to get a sample of what's living on the ground in terrestrial ecosystems. And so these are some pictures of some of the things that you might expect to find on the dune. There are several kinds of flies that you find out there. There are larvae of different species. This thing in the lower left is a spider that has its legs kind of curled up. This is a dead after we've sampled it. Spiders are very abundant out on the dunes. Down here, these are roly-polies or pill bugs, abundant back in the wooded portions of the dunes. By far the most common thing we find out on the dunes are these pictures here. These are all different kinds of ants, and ants really dominate the invertebrate diversity and abundance out on the dunes. Okay, and so I just want to take a moment here and summarize our sampling effort. So we had a total of 218 of these hula hoop quadrat sites that we sampled, and we did each of those sites 4 times. So once in May, once in June, once in July, and once in August. And so for each of those sites and each of those samples, we deployed one of those test tubes and then collected the test tube and counted the invertebrates that we that fell in the tube. For each of those same 218 sites, we sampled the plants. We went back twice. This wasn't to recount plants, but rather to see plants when they were flowering. There are several species on the dunes that you can only identify reliably when they have a flower head, especially grasses. And so we went back at least twice to try to get those plants when they were flowering. To summarize sort of the overall numbers that we saw, so the total abundances of different things that we sampled, plants, we counted about 4,300 individual plants across these sampling sites. There were about 2,000 ants that we sampled, and those 2,000 ants were part of approximately 9,300 invertebrates sampled. So we sampled a lot of individual organisms in this survey, okay? And then for each of these 218 sites within the circular quadrat, we measured some aspects of the, that you can think of more like the abiotic environment. So what was the ground cover like? How much sand was there? How much of a coverage did we have with different types of vegetation, which can be important for defining things like soil temperatures and humidities. And then again, at each site, we measured how firm the sand is with a special device called the penetrometer. Okay, and so now what I want to do is take you through some of the results, and the results are going to look like this for several slides. And so I want to walk you through what these graphs are telling us before I go through what the results actually were. And so on each of these graphs, we have on the x-axis, we have the number of individuals sampled. So for example, on this slide, we're thinking about plants. This is the number of individual plants sampled. And on the y-axis, we have species diversity. The measure here is the number of species. And so, for example, 30 on here would mean that we sampled 30 species at a particular, on one of these lines. In the graph on the left, each of the lines is one of the sites. So SS stands for Surf Song, SS1, Surf Song 1, WB, West Beach, etc. Okay. And then as we go through this on the right, you're going to see the same sort of graphic, except that the lines now indicate how far we are from the foredune. So 0 meters means that we were right on the foredune, and then it goes inland from there up to 60 meters away from that foredune. Okay. And so what the reason these curves look the way they do is that there are some statistical considerations that need to be made that are related to sampling in ecology. And so on each of these curves, you'll see a solid symbol. So on this blue curve, there's a blue dot. On this red curve, you can see a red triangle. On the green curve, there's a hollowed out green circle. Those are the actual data. So for example, in this blue curve is West Beach. On the blue curve, we sampled about 500 individuals, and those 500 individuals made up about 45 species, give or take, okay? Whereas, let's see, come down here to Surf Song 1, there we sampled about, maybe about 900 individuals, and those 900 individuals made up about 25 different species, okay? And so what the analysis does is it says, okay, those are the actual data. Now let's use some statistics to interpolate an accumulation curve and then extrapolate that curve out to a greater number of samples. And what this allows us to do is then vertically compare the diversity of species, given the fact that we sampled different numbers of individuals at each site, okay? And so you're gonna see this over and over. The dotted line is an extrapolation out to, out beyond the normal sample. The solid line to the left is an interpolation where we are statistically interpolating the data back to 0. Again, allowing us to make comparisons at different sites where we sample different numbers of individuals. Okay, and another thing to note on here, another couple things. One is that when you see a plateau, it indicates that we had complete sampling, in that sampling additional individuals would very likely not result in more species. And when you see a sample where we're still kind of going up, like this blue one, you can clearly see that this blue line is still on an upward trajectory. This means that we had incomplete sampling. This means that, you know, even though we had tubes deployed at 60 meters inland, those tubes sampled few individuals but captured many species, suggesting that if we had sampled more individuals, we would have gotten a lot more species. But we didn't, just because that was our sampling scheme, our sampling availability, okay? And so let's actually look at what these results tell us. And so this graph on the left here, what it's going to tell us is that West Beach, which is the blue curve, and Surf Song 2, which is the orangish curve, are the most diverse sites. They have somewhere around 40 species of plants. Whereas Surf Song 1 and Surf Song 2, the red and the black gray color, are the least diverse, with somewhere around 25 to 30 species. Okay, if we come over to what's going on with the dunes, plants were most diverse in the middle part of the dunes, so sort of 20 to 40 meters away from the foredune. You can see that we have the greatest diversity, somewhere between 45 and 50 species of plants. Whereas, and then the foredune here in red is the least diverse. So right out there at the beach edge is the least diverse. And then 60 meters inland, as I mentioned before, is, we're not sure. It's just grossly undersampled. The reason it's grossly undersampled is that there aren't many sites where you actually still have dunes 60 meters from the beach. And that happens because development happens about 60 meters from the beach. There's many of the houses and the condos that are built somewhere between 40 and 60 meters from the beach. And so there was only a few sites where we had that sampling availability. If we look at the types of species we found, and in particular what I want to focus on here are unique species, you can see that pretty much every single site we sampled had some complement of unique species, okay? So for example, if we come here to West Beach 1, West Beach 1 had a fern, which species, I don't know the species, I was not able to identify the species of that fern, but it's a unique fern, and a species called hairy pinweed. Whereas Surf Song had seashore elder. Whereas Surf Song 2 had a bunch of unique species. And what I mean by unique is that we found them at Surf Song 2, but we didn't find them at the other 4 sites, okay? So this is important because it tells us that, you know, even though the dune may look fairly homogeneous to you know, a person passing by, that's not the case. Spatially, the dunes have different pockets of biodiversity that are unique depending on where you're at along the beachfront at Kiawah. The same is true when we talk about distance from foredunes. So you can see that when you're right up on the beach, there are 3 species, so American sea rocket, seashore elder, and Russian thistle. You only find those right out on the foredune in that very loose sand. Whereas if we go down to the bottom, 60 meters from the dune is the only place you'll find this is a grass than paspalum, and then poison ivy is more associated with woodlands. You find that fairly far away from the beachfront. So again, this is telling us that it's not just the beachfront that's important for dune biodiversity, but it's actually having a wide swath of dune that helps to support different species within each of these zones. Okay, and so now what we'll do is we'll think about ants, and then we'll think about invertebrates in general. And so for ant biodiversity, what do we see? Well, we see that West Beach is the most diverse. It has somewhere around 12 ant species. I won't get into the details, but 3 of those species are unique. So at West Beach, you find 3 ant species that you do not find at the other sites. Surf Song and the 3 Surf Song sites and West Beach 1 are all about the same. There's somewhere around 7, 8, 9 species of ants. You really can't differentiate the number of ants at these. But they do have some unique ant genera or ant groups within them. And so again, it's telling us that the dunes at Kiawah are not homogeneous with regard to ant communities. The general message that we're looking at when we think about diversity in terms of distance from the foredune is that as you move away from the foredune, you see more ant diversity. And so when we get to the 40-meter point, we see somewhere around 12 ants, whereas at the 0-meter point, right on the foredune, we only see about 9. Again, the 60-meter, we only saw 6 species, but the sampling is so low that we don't really know what this would truly look like. And I would predict that with more sampling, it would actually be somewhere up here because those wooded areas are very likely going to harbor a greater diversity of ants. If we look at invertebrates in general, one of the broad statements we can say is that, remember when we see an increasing trend in these lines, it means undersampling. We can say that we undersampled invertebrates at basically all sites. We really don't see a leveling off for any of the sites. Maybe we start to see a leveling off here at West Beach, but most of the other ones we see it's still increasing. And so this tells us, even though we sampled somewhere around, remember the total was around 10,000, 9 to 10,000 individuals, even though we sampled a ton of individuals, we are incomplete. And part of the reason that's happening is that our sampling is dominated by 2 specific groups. And so in those tubes, most of what we find are ants and mites. They account for somewhere close to 90% of our samples. Okay, and so because of this sampling distribution, these sampling analyses tell us that we need a lot more samples in order to sort out how many species there truly are, because there are a lot of species that are relatively rare in our data set. Okay, and so that tells us something about the spatial patterns. We can see that there are spatial patterns on the dunes at Kiawah. There are unique plants and ants, depending on where you're located, and likely also invertebrates, although our sampling was didn't have enough resolution to tell us about that, about the total invertebrate spatial patterns. And so then I'd like to sort of tie things up here by thinking about if plants predict ants and invertebrates, and if plants, ants, and invertebrates are predicted by habitat characteristics. And so what I'm going to show you on the next couple slides is a different analysis. It's a multivariate analysis called partial least squares, which lets you, allows you to try to predict one set of variables from another set of variables. And what we're going to try to do with this is we're going to try to predict ant richness and abundance. That's where we're going to start here. We're going to try to predict ant diversity from the physical characteristics of the environment. And what we see, sort of the overall take-home message from this is that the predictive power of the environmental characteristics are really low. Only about 5% of the variation in ant richness and abundance is predicted by this plot you see on the right. If you want to take something away from the plot, what you can take away from it is that the abundance of ants, indicated by N on this plot, which is this vector, this arrow right here, is most closely associated with penetrance, which is this long arrow here. So you can see those 2 arrows go in the same direction and they're both fairly long. So firmer soils are associated with just more individual ants. And then you can see that shade is in the opposite direction of the vector for N. And so that tells us that less shade is associated with more ants. So open sites with harder, firmer, more hard packed soils are associated with a greater number of ants. Plant diversity has nothing to do with ant diversity, at least given our sampling resolution. If we look at invertebrates, we see the same sort of story, very low predictive power here. If you want to take one thing away from this slide, it's again that it appears that firmer soils are associated with an increase in invertebrate abundance, but again, the explanatory power is quite low. Oops, sorry about that. And then finally, what we might want to think about is, well, are there individual plant species that might be able to predict individual invertebrate species? And so with this, again, I want to highlight this lower corner here. There is a significant relationship here, but the predictive power is really low. It's only about 4% of the variation in invertebrates is explained by plants. And what we see from this plot is that there are a few associations. So for example, sand live oak is associated with a couple, a species of spider and a specific kind of fly. Slash pine and Virginia creeper and live oak, so these woody type species are sort of pulling out things like the long-legged fly from the rest of this cluster, earwig and roach, millipede and pillbug. So there are a few species of invertebrates getting pulled away from the overall cluster by essentially by trees or Virginia creeper, which is of course associated with trees. Okay, so what's the overall take home from this study? The first is that diversity is highest at West Beach and in the intermediate dune. The reason this is happening, well, it's likely that West Beach was the most diverse because it had a protected forest area, and it's one of the only places that we were able to sample in that protected forest area. And so that's an important thing to consider, is that if we can protect some of the forest associated with the dunes, that may help to increase overall biodiversity on the dunes. Most sites and distances from the foredune had unique species. And so remember, basically each of our sampling sites, Surf Song 1, Surf Song 2, Surf Song 0, etc., had unique species. 0 meters, 20 meters, 40 meters, 60 meters, all had unique species. So preserving or conserving all of the dune is important for preserving these unique species that we find at these sites. Plant species and environmental variables are generally poor predictors of ant and invertebrate species diversities. We might see some indication that firmer soils are associated with greater abundances of ants in particular, but again, the predictive power was only about 5%, so it's not very good. Okay, and so what might we conclude from these results? The first is that you may want to make some effort to conserve adjacent segments of the forest and maintain the widest dune system possible. So for example, one thing is that's commonly done in these dune systems is removing trees. And I realize that there are many factors that go into deciding whether or not to remove or even head off trees. But if some of those trees could be kept, there is an indication in these data that the trees in particular provide important habitat for some unique species. The other part is to conserve the dune wherever possible. So even tiny pieces of highly impacted dune, like West Beach 1. West Beach 1 was a really thin strip. It was near, it's near some condominiums and one of the swimming pools, the public swimming pool, really highly disturbed, but it also had several unique species, and so it was important as part of the overall diversity on Kiawah Island. And then one of the other things is that sites disturbed by wind and or foot traffic might result in looser sands, which means a less firm sand, and this results potentially in lower biodiversity. So of course the foredune and the wind hitting the foredune is something that we have no control over, and the foredune is part of what's going on there is that there are unique species, but overall there are fewer species that are able to survive in that very dynamic environment. However, as you move back into the dune, I often saw out there were places where people were walking through the dunes. Well, that foot traffic on the dune sand loosens the soil up. It actually doesn't pack it down, it makes it more loose. It breaks apart the dune sand, and as a result, there's some, although weak, there's some indication in our data that this may result in lower biodiversity. Okay, and so with that, I'd like to thank you for listening to my presentation.
Well, thank you for sharing your research. That was a really thoughtful and concise presentation. Were you surprised by any of the results?
Yes, so on Kiawah Island, we found that harvester ants were very abundant, and this other type of ant called pyramid ants were far less abundant. And that is quite different from what we found on Sullivan's Island, where you find very few harvester ants and really an overwhelming amount of pyramid ants. So there seems to be something different between these two islands in terms of the relative numbers of these two ant groups. One other surprising finding was there is a section of the dune that has ferns that are growing essentially on the foredune. I think most people would not associate ferns with dune habitat at all, let alone the foredune. They were fully exposed to the sun, growing right next to things like sea oats. So why they were there, I'm not entirely sure. It could be that they used to be in forest, and over the years the dune has eroded and left them in an area that used to be more covered and maybe a bit more moist. But there is still a very large population near the community, near the pool in the West Beach area of this fern, and they reproduce and they seem to be doing well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Do you have any thoughts for follow-up research on Kiawah or other barrier islands near Charleston?
Yeah, so one thing on Kiawah is we were only able to sample maybe about a third to a quarter of the dune systems on the island. And this had a lot to do with permission, both legal permission from the College of Charleston in terms of where I'm allowed to work. And then, of course, there are different entities that own different parts of the dunes on Kiawah, and there were issues with permissions. And so it would be great to go back and sample, for example, down in the county park or up to the east and north of the Gulf, what is it, ocean?
The ocean course.
The ocean course. Those areas are maybe the least human impacted dune systems on the island, and we have no samples from those areas. So it may be that there are other species of both plants and invertebrates in those spots that we didn't see. Another interesting thing that came out of this study was that when we found trees, we tended to see an increase in diversity. So areas with more sort of shady vegetation tended to have, and shady vegetation and also sort of differences in the soil tended to have higher diversity. And so it'd be interesting to go back and actually design a study that measures this. So look at areas specifically under trees and compare those to areas that are specifically chosen that have no trees. Or looking at it experimentally, many people cut down vegetation, especially the tall vegetation, to maintain their view of the ocean. And so we could design this with the landowners to sample maybe before and after those trees are removed to see what effect it has on those local communities.
Oh, that would be interesting. I hope you're able to do that. I look forward to hearing about those results. Thanks. Well, how do you assess, in general, how do you assess the overall ecological health of a dune?
Well, from my perspective, it has a lot to do with biodiversity. So how many species do you find, and then what are the abundances of those species? So it's not just enough to find 20 species, you want to find 20 species, and at least for some of those species, you want to find lots of individuals. And to me, those two components would indicate health of many different types of ecosystems, including the dunes. The trouble is that there are not a huge number of studies that quantify plants and animals at the level of detail that we did on Kiawah and on Sullivan's Island. And so really to make a firm statement about health, we would need data from lots of different islands, maybe with different levels of human impacts, a much larger scale study than what we did at Kiawah. However, what I will say is that on Kiawah in the dunes, you find all of the characteristic species that you would expect in the Southeast US. In many places, the dune system seems relatively undisturbed, and those species have large, robust populations. So I view the dunes at Kiawah as overall in pretty good shape.
That's great. Yeah, well, that's really good to hear. So from the conservancy perspective, is there something we could be doing to measure the health of dune habitats over time? I mean, we'd love to get you back, but just in general from the perspective of our organization?
Well, and that's the key component you said is time. So really these assessments of health or biodiversity are somewhat time dependent. So you need to take regular measurements of an ecosystem, of a specific ecosystem, like the dunes on Kiawah or the woods on Kiawah or the marsh. You need to have those happen every few years, every 5 years, every 10, some regular interval, to then have the long-term data needed to say, is there change happening? And if there is change happening, you know, are there factors we can point to that have caused that change? For example, had you went to Kiawah Island 50 years ago, there would have been barely any homes. You know, very few people were there, and for sure the overall ecological health or status of the island would have been very different than it is today, where humans have, I mean, everything, not everything, but most of the island is now developed. Although it is developed in, I think, a conscientious way. So when you drive on the roads in Kiawah, there still are lots of trees. You still see lots of the characteristic species. Certainly those populations are smaller today than they were 50 to 100 years ago. Certainly the dunes have been impacted to some extent in the past 50 to 100 years. So the question is, 50 years into the future, what will the dunes look like? And we don't know that without the data in hand. We do know some things we can do to conserve what is there. For example, using the footpaths over the dunes instead of walking on the dunes. Minimizing construction on the dune itself. So sort of stopping the construction up to where the dune system starts is important, of course, for preserving the dune, but also important for protecting the construction from things like tides and storm surges.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Is there any kind of a final message you'd like to share with Kiawah residents and visitors about the dunes and maintaining their biodiversity and vibrancy?
So I think people should appreciate that the dune systems along the ocean in the southeast U.S. are a unique ecosystem. So there are species we find in these dune systems where we find nowhere else in the world. And so people need to appreciate that. I think oftentimes people, as they walk over the dunes on their way to the beach, maybe look at it as sort of in the way or an annoyance, or, you know, oh, there's just I see a couple of grasses and a bunch of sand. But the reality is that those grasses and many of the small plants and animals that live there, this is it for them. These little slivers, these strips that are between the ocean and where we build homes or where the forest grows, are really the only place where some of these species exist. And so people should appreciate that biodiversity is there, unique biodiversity. Another thing I think people should be aware of is that it is common practice, not just on Kiawah, but across up and down the coast, to remove trees to maintain the view of the ocean. And I think that that's something that will continue. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's okay to manage land, but if we could maintain a few of those trees here and there, I think they do a couple things. One is that they provide shade, which is important for many different organisms. For example, when I would go through some of the shady thickets under oak trees on the dunes, I would routinely flush deer, other small mammals, and lots of little birds. And so they depend on that shade in the midday sun to survive on the dunes. There are also, of course, plant and insect species that are going to be more specialized to the cooler, shadier habitats under the trees. And then another thing that I noticed on the dunes regularly was that painted buntings, which is a species that many people are aware of, they're quite beautiful. The males regularly would use isolated pine trees, especially to sing from. And so we heard them almost every day throughout the summer, and there were specific spots where you could go and you knew that that pine tree would have a painted bunting at some point calling. So while removing trees, again, we will continue to do that as a part of the overall management strategy. Allowing a few of them here and there to remain, I think is important. And then, of course, everybody knows, I mean, I think everybody that knows about the importance of dunes to humans knows that, of course, they protect us from storm surge. That's a really important thing in terms of hurricanes and thinking about the increasing severity of hurricanes potentially into the future. And so, again, maintaining the dunes and maintaining a wide dune is important for buffering buildings and other structures and people from the storm surge coming from the ocean.
Well, thank you very much. This has been very interesting, and I've enjoyed discussing your research. So I hope we can get you back out to Kiawah. And I encourage our viewers, who I'm sure have enjoyed this presentation, to join us again. And remember that we now have a YouTube channel. And we look forward to talking to Dr. McElroy moving forward, and hope others will join us for additional presentations. Thank you.